Sukui Gar Nervod. I am Tad Larkin, the lore master of Manda-LORE, and today I'll be digging through the archives to elaborate on the legendary Clan Fett. Out of all the Mandalorian clans throughout galactic history, none is more iconic or widely known than Clan Fett. It should be noted before we begin our examination of Clan Fett that not all Mandalorian clans are made up of single families. Some encompass multiple family units, but most of the time share the same surname. This is even made more complex by the Mandalorian penchant for adoption by the right of Guy Balmanda, so keep in mind that some of the figures about to be mentioned may not be blood related. We start off with the first ever named Fett, Cassius Fett, a human male who was active during the Mandalorian Wars from 3976 BBY to 3960 BBY. Around 3978 BBY, Cassius was chosen by Manda-LORE the Ultimate to be the leader of the newly established Mandalorian Neo-Crusaders, an elite group within the Mandalorians that wore standardized rank color-coded armor, and with him as their field marshal, he turned the former cult into a well-trained and well-equipped force. In 3976, the Mandalorians began expanding outward from the Manda-LORE sector, gobbling up star systems on the outskirts of Galactic Republic territory, and it was policies introduced by Cassius Fett that allowed the Mandalorians to hold on to these systems and draw in new recruits for the Mandalorian Crusaders and Neo-Crusaders, rather than just raiding the planets and moving on as the Manda-LORE had done in the past. As the Mandalorian Wars were ramping up and a full-scale invasion of the Republic was underway, Cassius devised a three-pronged assault against the Republic in the Galactic Northern Quadrant, striking at Vanquo, Serja, and his crowning achievement, the subjugation of mighty Terrace. It was his strategy that led Mandalore's armies to victory at several subsequent engagements, taking possession of most of the Galactic Northeastern Quadrant and pushing the Republic all the way back to Duro in the Core Worlds region. It wouldn't be until a group of rogue Jedi known as the Revanchists broke their mandate of neutrality set by the Jedi Order and bolstered the beleaguered Republic forces that the Republic started gaining back their worlds, and it is unknown whether Cassius Fett met his demise at the Battle of Malachor V like so many of the other Manda-LORE, including Manda-LORE the Ultimate, but records of him cease after the conclusion of the Mandalorian Wars in 3960. There is, however, an offhand mention of Cassius Fett having a son, yet we have no records of what his name was, his accomplishments, or any of his offspring. That being said, while we do know the Fett line continued, there is over 300 Galactic Standard years of missing records. This is due largely in part to poor record keeping and the Mandalorian preference of passing down history orally through stories and boasts, which requires galactic historians such as myself to verify with outside sources, which are sometimes non-existent. The next named Fett we have record of is Vorten Fett, who was active during the Cold War circa 3653 BBY to 3642 BBY. During the Cold War and the previous Great Galactic War, the Mandalorians were in the service of the reconstituted Sith Empire, and Vorten Fett served as a commander, and was garrisoned on Sith-occupied Terrace. After the resuming of hostilities between the Republic and the Sith Empire, Vorten was last seen accompanying Manda-LORE the Vindicated to a secret meeting on Ilum regarding Darth Malgus's usurping of the Empire following the Emperor's apparent death. There was another named Fett that existed around the same time as Vorten. Como Fett was another human male Mandalorian, and served as an advisor to Manda-LORE the Avenger, who took power after the death of Manda-LORE the Vindicated. During this time, a third player had entered into the Galactic War, the Eternal Empire of Zakul, and the forces of the Sith Empire, Galactic Republic, and the Mandalorian clans turned their focus towards fighting the Eternal Empire's onslaught. Como was a hardened warrior and veteran of many battles. Having outlived the average warrior life expectancy at that time, he earned the nickname Old Man, despite being nowhere near elderly in the conventional sense. Before the Eternal Empire's invasion, Como had forged Clan Fett into some of the most ruthless warriors, but sadly lost most of them to the Eternal Empire's automated skytroopers during the onslaught. He would later redeem himself at the Battle of Darvanis, leading his clan, among other Mandalorian clans, in an assault on an Eternal Empire factory that manufactured skytroopers, and although the battle was costly, they were ultimately victorious. It is after Como Fett and the Third Galactic War that we have another long period of essentially no records on Clan Fett, and whether they participated in the subsequent New Sith Wars or the myriad of other small planetary wars Mandalorians would often be hired to fight in, it is unknown. What we do know is that sometime prior to 80 BBY, the remnants of Clan Fett settled on the agricultural world of Concord Dawn in the Manda-LORE sector, and bought land for grain farming. The man who would become the father of Jango Fett, as well as the woman who would become his mother, remain nameless, as Jango rarely ever mentioned his biological parents in his brief, sometimes curt log entries, but when he did, they were referred to as mother and father. Jango did have a named older sister, however. Arla Fett was born in 72 BBY, but unlike Jango, her life would be a bit more tragic. During a battle of the Mandalorian Civil War on Concord Dawn in 58 BBY, the 14-year-old Arla, along with her parents, were held at Blaster Point by the Mandalorian Death Watch, seeking Jaster Mareel, the current Manda-LORE and leader of the true Mandalorians, who had retreated to the vicinity of the Fett farm after losing the battle. Fett's parents refused to yield Jaster's location, and Tor Vizsla, leader of the Death Watch, had them executed. But as Jango fled into the grain fields where he'd eventually bump into Jaster Mareel, Vizsla ordered that she'd be taken care of, and that the Death Watch did not leave witnesses. Unexpectedly, Arla was spared. However, she would end up wishing she wasn't, as she would be tortured and passed around by the cruel Death Watch. Eventually, she joined them, and became an assassin, remaining an assassin even after the organization's disbandment after Tor Vizsla's death in 42 BBY. In 32 BBY, she would be arrested after a botched job by the Coruscant Security Force, and after being deemed mentally unstable by the courts, she was committed to the Valorum Center, where she would later be broken out by a Jedi-turned-Mandalorian, Barden Yusik, who was trying to free a different prisoner, and a group of rogue ARC troopers at the end of the Clone Wars. Barden, who was an established Jedi healer, tried to ease the manic Arla, but she still attacked him and others unprovoked, so she decided that she'd rather forget who she was and what she went through, and only then could she move on with her life, so Yusik agreed to wipe her memory with the Force. Despite the age gap, some records seem to indicate that Arla Fett would learn to love and even marry Barden Yusik, who by then was under a pseudonym to hide from the Empire, making her part of Clan Skirata, which will be a separate transmission for another time. Jango Fett was born 6 years after his older sister in 66 BBY, also on Concord Dawn, but his story would turn out far different from hers. After watching his parents executed and his sister taken to supposedly be killed later, Jango ran into Jaster Mareel and his contingent of true Mandalorians fleeing the Fett homestead. As the Death Watch burned down the crop fields, Jango helped them escape through an irrigation pipe, and even helped them blow up a Death Watch armored personnel carrier in a subsequent ambush in one of Concord Dawn's towns. With no family left, Jango was adopted by Jaster by the right of Gaibal Manda, a Mandalorian tradition of adopting children, usually war orphans, into their clan. Jaster trained him in the ways of the Manda-LORE, and when he came of age, began fighting by his adoptive father's side. However, during the Battle of Korta 6 in 52 BBY, Jaster was gunned down by Tor Vizsla, leaving Jango to take up the mantle of Manda-LORE and lead the true Mandalorians against the Death Watch. He campaigned for 8 years until the fateful Battle of Galadran, where he and the true Mandalorians were tricked by the Death Watch allied governor of Galadran, who hired them to take out a group of Galadranian rebels, but then framed it as a massacre of innocent protesters. The Republic responded by sending a Jedi task force led by then Jedi Master Dooku, and although Jango fought bravely, killing 5 Jedi himself, the rest of his men were slaughtered, and he was sold into slavery. He eventually escaped, got his revenge on the governor, recovered his armor, and proceeded to hunt down and kill Vizsla, bringing an end to the Death Watch and a beginning to his successful bounty hunting career. By 32 BBY, Jango was approached by a Lord Tyrannus to enter a contest with several other bounty hunters to hunt down and kill the deranged leader of the Bando Gora, the former Jedi Knight Komari Vosa. After chasing leads and brawling to the death with his old rival during the Mandalorian Civil War, Montross, Jango tracked Vosa to one of the moons of Bogdan, where, just as he was about to land the killing blow, Tyrannus himself arrived and gave him the offer of a lifetime. Jango agreed to be the prime clone template for an army that would eventually bring the destruction of the Jedi Order on one condition, that he could keep the first one for himself, with no genetic modification. After hand-picking 100 of the best mercenaries and bounty hunters that he knew, 75 of which were Mandalorian like himself, Jango traveled to Kamino to begin training the Grand Army of the Republic. Though Jango had a contract with the Clone Masters on Kamino, he also took a contract from the Separatists, attempting to assassinate Naboo Senator Padme Amidala, which would eventually lead to the discovery of the Clone Army and the beginning of the Clone Wars in 22 BBY. Jango would meet his end in the Red Sands of Geonosis when he was decapitated by Jedi Master Mace Windu in the Petranaki Arena, as 200 Jedi attempted to rescue Amidala, Anakin Skywalker, and Obi-Wan Kenobi. His clone son, Boba Fett, extracted from the cloning tubes in 32 BBY, was there to witness this, and the 10-year-old Boba was forced to bury his father in the red sands of that alien world, as the galaxy fell apart around him. Boba spent a majority of the Clone Wars evading bounty hunters like Aurra Sing, who was after Jango's fortune, and Dirge, eventually coming into the service of Jabba the Silajik Tior, who had Jango's armor resized to fit the young Boba. At the age of 13, Boba began taking on bounties, and after the Clone Wars, he even took contracts on fugitive Jedi for the newly established Galactic Empire. By the age of 16, Boba fell in love with and married a Kefar bounty hunter named Sintes Vel, and together they had a daughter, Aelin Vel, and they settled on Concord Dawn to attempt a normal life. Using Jaster Muriel as a pseudonym, Boba became a journeyman protector, law enforcement on the rural Concord Dawn. However, when his commanding officer forced himself on his wife, Boba killed him and fled in exile, leaving Sintes and Aelin and returning to a life of bounty hunting. Boba would go on to become one of the most successful and richest bounty hunters in the history of the profession. However, there was a few snags he hit from time to time, like when trying to deliver a carbonite-encased Han Solo to Jabba the Hutt, as well as his subsequent run-in with the Sarlacc, which found him somewhat indigestible. Eventually, Boba's Mandalorian heritage would be, against his will at first, thrust back upon him, when he promised a dying Ven Shisa, the current Manda-LORE at the time, that he would take up the mantle his father once occupied and lead the Mandalorian clans. The reluctant Manda-LORE struggled not only to fit in with his new subjects, but with the culture as well, learning a lot from his friend Goran Baveen, eventually earning their respect after leading them through the war with the extragalactic Yuuzhan Vong. During the Second Galactic Civil War, however, Boba would face new hurdles leading the Mandalorians, especially with the emergence of his estranged daughter and newfound granddaughter. Aelin Vel was a half-human, half-Kefar bounty hunter born in 15 BBY to Boba Fett and Sintes Vel. Her father walked out on her when she was just 3 years old, and by the time she was 16, her mother went missing and was presumed dead. She herself followed in her parents' footsteps and became a bounty hunter. She eventually fell in love with and married a Mandalorian merc named Mayken Merrick, and together they had a daughter, Mirta Gev. However, Merrick would later die in a starship accident, leaving Aelin and Mirta to fend for themselves. Aelin made several attempts to kill her father, who she blamed for not only abandoning her, but her mother's death as well. However, on one occasion in 40 ABY, while working with Mirta to try to lure Fett to Coruscant, she was picked up by the Galactic Alliance Guard, and, suspected of being a Corellian terrorist, she was killed during interrogation by Jacen Solo. Last but certainly not least, we have Mirta Gev, granddaughter of Boba Fett, who was raised by her mother to hate her grandfather, and in turn learning her Mandalorian culture and heritage from her father. In 40 ABY, Mirta was tasked by her mother to track down her grandfather, baiting him with a Heart of Fire gemstone he had given to Cintas during their wedding vows, claiming she needed help finding Aelin. The now 70-year-old Fett, who was currently dying from a degenerative process resulting from his clone origins and desiring to reconnect with his daughter before his death, agreed. Mirta aided Fett in assassinating Corellian president and estranged cousin of Han Solo, Thraken Sal Solo, but soon after learned of her mother's death and the jig was up. She confessed all to her grandfather at Blaster Point, but rather than shooting him, she accompanied him to Coruscant, where they reclaimed Aelin's body and buried her on Geonosis next to Jango. Still attempting to reconcile, she then tagged along with her grandfather on a mission to find a clone bounty hunter by the name of Skirata, who was rumored to have a cure for the accelerated aging process experienced by clones. Skirata, who was later found to be Jang Skirata, one of the last of the Null ARC troopers who actually used to bully Boba back during their childhood on Kamino, no longer possessed the cure, but agreed to be a donor in a bone marrow transplant that saved his life. Boba and Mirta later found out that Cintas wasn't dead after all. She had been frozen in carbonite for over 40 years and forgotten, so they teamed up and recovered her. However, it would take a lot of patience and a 90-year-old former Jedi, Barden Yusuk, to heal Cintas's memory, and although she and Boba reconciled, they remained apart. After helping train Jaina Solo for her confrontation with her brother who fell to the dark side, Gev was tasked with leading a Mandalorian commando force to infiltrate the Anakin Solo, Jacen Solo's, now Darth Caedus's, flagship, but was captured, only being freed when Jaina herself snuck on board. Towards the end of the Second Galactic Civil War, Mirta would marry another Mandalorian, Gez Orad, and she received her own Mandalorian commando force, but was unable to return to Mandalore, as Darth Caedus, before his death, had seeded the planet's atmosphere with a nanovirus that targeted the Fett genome, so her and her Babuir would spend the next few years looking for a way to disable the nanovirus. Whether Mirta and her grandfather ever fixed the nanovirus problem remains uncertain, and whether Clan Fett continued on into the Sith Imperial War of 127 ABY is unknown. However, the legacy of Clan Fett will certainly never be forgotten, as its members were some of the most brutal, honorable, and cunning Mandalorian warriors the galaxy had ever seen. This ends my findings on Clan Fett. If you have any suggestions for future transmissions, don't be afraid to drop a comment. Special thanks to my patrons Wildcat144, Zexen, JTribs1997, Wirefox Terrier, Dave the Grave, Zim the Despot, Matt Patton, Trav, Hawk2274, Cal Scarata, Angry Mutt, Chris Evans, Mayo4, and Epileptic Zebra. If you'd like to support this channel, and perhaps even commission your own video topic, please visit my Patreon to find out how. Link is in the description. In the meantime, keep your comm channels open for future transmissions, and don't forget to subscribe. Tad Larkin, out.